I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The music was still playing inside Sandringham when a single sentence brought the royal table to a standstill. According to palace aides who later broke their silence, King Charles looked toward the empty place once reserved for his younger son and declared, "Harry may be my son, but he no longer speaks for this family." Yet it was Prince William's response moments later that turned private sorrow into a royal reckoning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Sandringham Winter Gala had been arranged as a private charitable gathering, bringing senior royals, military patrons, trusted household officials, and selected guests together inside the royal estate. Sandringham is the monarch's private country residence, used for family gatherings beyond the formal machinery of palace life. Harry and Meghan were absent, but their absence became impossible to ignore when an aide quietly removed 2 unused place cards before dinner began. The tension arrived during a closed post-dinner discussion about future royal representation, meaning who could officially appear and act on behalf of the monarchy. One senior courtier unexpectedly asked whether Harry might someday return for limited ceremonial duties. The question had not appeared on the agenda. Conversation stopped, and every person waited for the king. Charles answered with painful control. Harry remained his son, he said, but no longer spoke for the royal family. William then added, "Until trust is restored, there will be no return to royal duty." Aides later disclosed both statements through confidential accounts given after the gala, turning a private exchange into a public rupture. The king lowered his eyes and slowly turned his signet ring, the personal seal worn as a symbol of identity and authority. His decision sounded institutional, but the movement revealed a wounded father beneath the crown. William remained upright, yet Catherine noticed his hand tightening around the back of his chair. The future king sounded certain, because uncertainty had already cost the family too much. Camilla then delivered the sentence that changed sorrow into finality. According to one aide's documented account, the Queen quietly said, "Then everyone must stop pretending the old relationship still exists." Charles did not challenge her. William did not soften his position. A written record was created immediately afterward for the king's private secretary, the senior official who manages confidential royal business. It contained another remark that had not yet been disclosed. As William left, Anne followed him into the corridor and asked, "Was that the crown speaking, or the brother?" The leak revealed what had been said, but to understand why those words cut so deeply, the people sitting around that table, and the wounds each carried into the room had to be examined next. Behind the titles, uniforms, and polished speeches were 3 men bound by blood and divided by memory. Charles was not merely defending a monarchy, he was speaking about the son whose childhood he had watched unfold. William was not simply protecting royal duty, he was confronting the brother who once walked beside him through grief. And Harry, hundreds of miles away, had no idea his name had just frozen an entire ballroom. Charles carried an impossible burden. As sovereign, the reigning head of the monarchy, he had to protect public trust and ensure that anyone representing the crown could be relied upon. As a father, he carried guilt over how completely his relationship with Harry had collapsed. The king could defend the institution in speeches and meetings, but no royal title could protect him from the knowledge that his younger son now lived far beyond the family's reach. William's pain came from another place. He remembered when the brothers had appeared inseparable, especially after Diana's death, when shared grief had become both shield and prison. They walked together, smiled together, and learned to survive public attention together. That history made the present estrangement feel more brutal than an ordinary family dispute. The prince was not speaking about a distant relative. He was speaking about the boy who once understood his grief without explanation. Catherine found William alone beside a darkened window after the gala. He admitted that saying the words aloud had made the separation feel permanent. The princess listened, as her husband confessed that silence had allowed him to imagine reconciliation remained possible. Once the sentence was spoken, hope suddenly felt conditional. Charles faced the same truth at the table. When a footman began clearing the room, the king stopped him from removing the chair where Harry might once have sat. He stared at the empty place for several seconds, then quietly allowed it to be taken away. The gesture revealed what his declaration had concealed. Necessity had not erased sorrow. Camilla's firmness carried its own wounds. The queen feared that reconciliation without strict conditions would reopen years of accusations and destabilize Charles emotionally. Her language was protective, but resentment also lived beneath it. Anne distrusted such final declarations. The Princess Royal warned William that families often regret words spoken when the absent person cannot answer. In California, Harry received a message from a former palace employee. "Your name came up tonight. Prepare yourself." He read it twice. No explanation followed. The Sandringham words sounded sudden, but they were only the public crack above a fracture that had widened months earlier during one unforgettable confrontation. Every family rupture has a moment that later feels inevitable. A door closing, a hand withdrawn, a sentence that cannot be taken back. For Harry and the palace, that moment came during a private remembrance ceremony at Windsor. What should have been a quiet tribute to Diana instead became the confrontation senior aides would later identify as the point of no return, setting the stage for everything spoken at Sandringham. William had organized the ceremony inside the private chapel at Windsor several months before the gala. The chapel was a family place of worship, used for intimate services, away from public crowds, and attendance had been deliberately limited to close relatives. The prince wanted the anniversary to remain focused on Diana, not on the wider conflict that had consumed the family. Harry asked to join through a secure video link and requested that a written message be read aloud on his behalf. Charles initially considered allowing it. The king believed grief should rise above division, and he hoped the tribute might create one small space where father and sons could remember the same woman without reopening every argument between them. Minutes before the ceremony, William refused permission. He said their mother's memorial could not become another battleground over public narratives. The sealed envelope was returned unopened to Harry's representative. That decision became the specific trigger behind everything that followed. Charles challenged his elder son privately in the vestry, the small room beside a chapel where clergy and family members prepare before a service. He asked whether the refusal was unnecessarily severe. William answered that trust had been broken too many times, and that Diana's memory could not be used as a route back into royal life. The king heard caution in the words, but he also heard anger. Harry waited beside his phone for confirmation that the message had been delivered. When his representative called and explained that the envelope had been returned, he became silent. Then he asked only, "Did my father agree?" The answer wounded him more deeply than the rejection itself. A handwritten scheduling note later showed that Camilla had advised Charles not to overrule William, warning that interference would weaken the heir's authority inside his own family. Anne witnessed the aftermath and saw the prince leave the vestry visibly shaken. She later told an aide in a documented account that the decision might have been defensible, but the manner of it had turned caution into humiliation. At Sandringham, Anne intended to confront William directly, and this time, Charles would hear every word. The rejected letter had never been forgotten, and when Anne finally confronted William after the gala, the argument dragged every buried grievance back into the open. The ballroom doors had barely closed when Princess Anne caught up with William in Sandringham's east corridor. There were no cameras, no prepared remarks, and no advisors standing between them. Only a sister defending a wounded father, an heir defending the crown, and one absent prince whose name had become impossible to speak without reopening the past. Then Anne stepped in front of William and demanded an answer he could not avoid. Anne had always valued duty, but she had never confused discipline with emotional dishonesty. The Princess Royal supported William's authority as heir, the person next in line to the throne, yet she remained disturbed by how completely the family had begun treating Harry as a permanent threat. The prince believed every unresolved private conflict could become a constitutional distraction, meaning a family crisis capable of weakening public trust in the monarchy. His fear was not only what his brother might say, but what any future conversation might become once it left the room. Anne blocked his path. "Look at me and say, he is no longer your brother." William stopped. He answered that Harry would always be his brother, but brotherhood could not automatically restore trust or royal responsibility. Anne told him his statement inside the ballroom had sounded less like protection and more like punishment. The future king reacted sharply. She had not endured every private conversation that later appeared in public, every attempt at peace that became another accusation, or every moment when family pain was turned into a wider campaign. Charles approached after hearing raised voices. The king asked them both to stop, but Anne turned toward her brother and refused to soften the truth. His words at dinner, she said, had made reconciliation nearly impossible. The monarch looked wounded, yet William interrupted with a revelation recorded in a recent household briefing. Palace officials had received an inquiry from Harry's representative about attending a future state ceremony, a formal national event carried out in the sovereign's name. The request came with conditions the household considered unacceptable. Harry wanted written assurance that any private conversation with Charles would remain outside official palace summaries, the confidential records used to document important royal discussions. William saw the demand as secrecy without accountability. Anne saw a man who no longer trusted the institution to record him fairly. Charles heard both interpretations and understood that others had been deciding what his younger son's request meant before he had personally read it. The king ordered every relevant letter and internal note placed on his desk before midnight. This decision would no longer remain entirely in William's hands. Anne had forced the family argument into the open, but the real balance of power would be decided upstairs, where Charles examined the correspondence and discovered who had been shaping the palace response. Long after the final guests had departed, Charles sat alone in Sandringham's library, with Harry's correspondence spread across the desk. Every page carried the language of caution risk assessments, confidentiality warnings, constitutional boundaries, but beneath the official wording, the king began to see a pattern. Decisions presented as collective judgment had repeatedly been narrowed by one powerful inner circle. Leaving him to announce conclusions, he had never fully examined himself. Charles knew royal decisions rarely began with the sovereign alone. Private secretaries, communications advisors, security officials, and senior relatives shaped recommendations before any final approval reached his desk. A private secretary was the senior official responsible for managing confidential royal business and advice. As heir, William had also gained greater influence over choices that could affect the monarchy's future, and staff increasingly treated his approval as essential whenever Harry's name appeared. The king removed his glasses, set down his pen, and reread one paragraph stating that direct contact with his younger son could complicate unified institutional messaging. The phrase meant maintaining one official position across every royal household. But its coldness disturbed him. Harry had become a communications risk before he was considered a son. Charles read the line again and felt the weight of what had been lost between policy and blood. Then the anger came. He discovered that several conciliatory phrases he had dictated for an earlier letter had vanished before the final version was sent. His original words had left room for future conversation. The official copy had closed that space almost completely. Charles realized the correspondence had been made firmer without his full awareness. Camilla entered the library and defended the process. The Queen told him the restrictions had protected him from another painful cycle of hope, accusation, and disappointment. Charles looked at her and answered that protection was not the same as making decisions on his behalf. She saw how deeply the discovery had wounded him, yet she also feared what renewed contact might do. The file revealed the decisive name. Sir Michael Harcourt, a senior household advisor, had recommended rejecting Harry's ceremonial request before the king reviewed it. William later endorsed the recommendation. Attached to the papers was a handwritten line from the prince. "Do not let sentiment reopen a door we cannot safely close again." Charles recognized the fear behind his son's words. But he also began to question whether fear had quietly become policy. Before leaving the desk, the monarch summoned Harcourt for an early morning meeting and ordered William to attend. By dawn, the leak was no longer the only crisis facing Sandringham. Charles was preparing to confront the machinery that had turned family pain into official policy. At 7 the next morning, phones began vibrating across Sandringham. The private remarks about Harry had reached journalists, broadcasters, and royal correspondents before breakfast. Yet inside the estate, a more dangerous confrontation was unfolding. Charles had summoned William and the advisor who shaped the palace position, while Camilla stood outside the library doors, knowing that whatever happened next could fracture the royal household from within. The leak spread faster than the palace could contain it. Quotations attributed to Charles and William appeared across British media, while communications officers were ordered neither to confirm nor deny the exact wording until every aide present had been identified. The delay mattered because even a partial denial could deepen the scandal if the written record later proved the remarks were real. The consequences reached beyond the family. Planned announcements from the gala disappeared beneath the headlines. Charitable guests received urgent press inquiries, and a scheduled palace release was postponed to avoid appearing indifferent to the crisis. Harry saw the headline on his phone. "No return for Harry, Sandringham's private verdict." He left the breakfast table, closed his study door, and remained inside without speaking. Meghan followed him moments later. She argued that silence would allow the palace version to harden into accepted truth, but Harry refused an immediate statement. He wanted one answer first. Had his father truly said those words, or had another royal conclusion been sharpened by advisors before reaching the public? Inside the library, Charles confronted William. The king asked whether his handwritten warning had been intended to justify a complete barrier between father and son. The prince answered that he had meant to protect the crown, not prevent private contact. Royal duty, he insisted, required boundaries. It did not require emotional exile. Sir Michael Harcourt could no longer hide behind policy. Through the recorded meeting notes, the advisor admitted removing conciliatory sentences from Charles's earlier letter because he believed emotional language would invite negotiation. The monarch placed the altered message on the desk and dismissed him from every decision involving Harry. Protection had become control, and the king finally named it. Anne uncovered the source of the leak through a confidential staff interview. One aide had shared the remarks because the palace appeared ready to issue a misleading denial. The staff member had acted to force accountability, not simply profit from scandal. That truth made the betrayal no less serious, but it exposed how little trust remained inside the household. Charles asked for Harry's private number. No secretaries, no written summaries, no advisors listening. The institution had spoken through memoranda and warnings for years. But the turning point would come only when a father and son finally faced each other, without the palace standing between them. For once, there were no courtiers taking notes, no communications team preparing a statement, and no advisor waiting to reinterpret what had been said. Charles sat alone beside the library fire, while Harry answered from a closed room in California. An ocean separated them, but the greater distance had been built through years of suspicion. The king spoke first, and the opening words were not those of a sovereign. Charles knew why the call mattered. Previous contact had passed through private offices, representatives, and carefully drafted letters, each layer designed to prevent another crisis. A royal household was the team of officials managing a senior family member's duties and private business. But those protections had also stripped warmth from every exchange. Words were shortened, softened, hardened, or delayed, until father and son no longer knew whose voice they were hearing. The king asked that neither side record the conversation or release a summary. Harry agreed on one condition. No palace aide could later brief an official version of what had been said. Then Charles apologized. "I should have spoken to you before I allowed others to decide what silence meant." He did not withdraw his concerns about trust, but he accepted that institutional caution had replaced personal communication. Harry asked the question directly. Had his father truly said he no longer spoke for the family? Charles confirmed the sentence, then explained that he meant his younger son no longer represented the monarchy. Representation meant the authority to speak or act publicly in the crown's name. He had not meant that Harry had stopped belonging to the family. Harry's voice tightened. He said the distinction disappeared when every invitation, phone call, and private meeting became a constitutional negotiation. He then mentioned the Windsor Remembrance Letter and asked why it had been returned unopened. Charles went silent. The monarch admitted he believed the message had been received privately, even if William refused to have it read during the ceremony. He had not known the sealed envelope was sent back. That discovery changed the call. Anger gave way to shock, and Harry heard something he had not expected: his father questioning the process rather than defending it. Charles promised that future communication between them would pass directly from father to son. Harry agreed not to treat private reconciliation as an immediate route back to royal duty. Neither man called it peace. It was smaller than that, but perhaps more honest. Before ending the call, Charles said William needed to hear the truth about the returned letter. The call did not restore what had been lost, but it removed the first barrier and left William facing a truth that could no longer be dismissed as palace procedure. By midday, a private family sentence had become a national argument. Broadcasters debated loyalty, newspapers declared a royal exile, and crowds gathered outside palace gates carrying competing messages of anger and sympathy. Yet one front page captured the crisis more powerfully than any television panel. A photograph of Harry walking behind Diana's coffin beside the words, "Brothers then strangers now." The image changed the emotional temperature instantly. Commentators divided almost immediately. Some defended the Sandringham remarks as a necessary protection of royal duty, arguing that trust had to come before any return to official responsibility. Others said the monarchy had allowed constitutional language to erase basic family compassion. Constitutional roles meant the formal duties carried out on behalf of the crown, but the public could see how easily that language had begun to swallow the private bond between father, sons, and brothers. Palace communications officials prepared a careful response. The draft stressed that Harry remained a loved family member while confirming there was no present plan for him to resume royal work. Yet the statement felt colder beside the newspaper image. At a London newsstand near Buckingham Palace, commuters stopped before the front page showing young William and Harry behind Diana's coffin. Conversation faded. The contrast between childhood unity and adult estrangement left the crowd visibly shaken. Outside the Sandringham gates, another moment carried the same pain. A woman placed 2 white roses beside the entrance with a card reading, "For the brothers who lost the same mother." The gesture did not defend either side. It reminded everyone that both men had begun their lives inside the same grief. Catherine found William staring at the front page alone. The prince called the photograph unfair because it reduced years of broken trust to one childhood tragedy. Still, he could not look away. His anger weakened each time he saw the 2 boys walking together, before duty, resentment, and public exposure divided them. Charles changed the palace statement himself. The king added one sentence: "Family relationships must never be confused with constitutional roles, nor sacrificed to them." The wording quietly corrected the severity of his gala remarks, without reopening the question of royal duty. The household also announced that Sir Michael Harcourt would leave his advisory position while the altered correspondence and decision-making process were reviewed. But Charles knew removing an advisor would not repair the family. He requested one final private conversation with William. The boundary around royal responsibility would remain, but emotional exile could not become permanent policy. The world had already delivered its judgment, but the lasting meaning of Sandringham would be decided behind closed doors, where Charles and William confronted what the crown could demand and what a family could survive. The Sandringham leak did not restore Harry to royal duty, erase the accusations of the past, or reunite 2 brothers in a sudden embrace. Its consequence was more difficult and more honest. It forced the royal family to separate two questions they had allowed to become dangerously entangled: whether Harry could represent the crown again, and whether he still had a place within his own family. At last, the answers were no longer treated as identical. Charles met William inside the same library where the altered correspondence had first exposed how deeply advisors had shaped their decisions. The king made one boundary unmistakable: Harry would not return as a working royal under the present conditions. A working royal is a family member who officially represents the crown through public duties and engagements. Trust had been broken, and neither affection nor guilt could restore that responsibility overnight. The monarch then changed something more personal. He ordered that future private messages from his younger son must not automatically be treated as institutional requests. Family communication and royal negotiations would follow separate channels. A phone call from Harry would no longer be examined as though it were an application for authority before Charles had even heard it. William remained silent before admitting that returning the remembrance letter unopened had been unnecessarily cruel. The prince did not excuse previous breaches of trust, nor did he abandon the boundaries around Diana's ceremony. But he accepted responsibility for turning caution into humiliation. That admission cost him something, because it forced the future king to see how control could become punishment, even when it began as protection. Charles answered with the sentence that settled the argument: "You may protect the crown without asking me to bury my son." William absorbed the words without protest, then agreed that direct private contact should continue. The king opened a desk drawer and removed an old photograph of William and Harry laughing together at Balmoral. He placed it upright instead of returning it to the darkness. Balmoral was the family's Scottish estate, but in that moment, it represented something simpler: a time before grief became policy and brotherhood became risk. Charles later explained the arrangement during a second brief call with Harry. His son accepted that no royal position was being restored and agreed that reconciliation could not become a public campaign or bargaining tool. Sandringham ended the illusion that Harry could simply reclaim his former role. Yet it also ended the colder belief that losing royal duty required losing every family bond. Charles emerged chastened. William understood the cost of absolute control, and Harry received no victory, only clarity. The crown's door remained closed. The father's door did not. The words leaked from Sandringham had begun as a declaration of separation, but their final legacy was a boundary drawn with painful precision. Harry would no longer speak for the monarchy. Yet he would not be erased from the family that shaped him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.